Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin to enter into the budget process with the various Metro departments, and especially the Metropolitan Board of Education, we, the council and the vice mayor, thought that this would be a great opportunity to have a joint meeting with the Budget and Finance Committee and Education Committee, and to invite the Metro Board of Education and the school board to basically explain what approach they're using as they look at funding and operating the budget and also the capital budget and the strategy and processes that are used. So if we'd like to limit the questions to that today, because we do have another meeting pertaining to the audit next week. So if we would, and we are limited for time. So if you would, I'd like to introduce our guest today. We have from the Metro Board of Education, Superintendent Jesse Register, Chris Henson, Chief Financial Officer, and Metro School Board Chairperson Anna Shepard. What we'd like to do is open it up to Mr. Henson to kind of explain the process, and then after a short period of time, we will open it up for questioning.
Councilman Pridemore, if I may, I'll
see if that
is it on?
Yes.
Okay. Councilman Pridemore, I'll make a few brief remarks and not take very much time at all, and then turn it over to Mr. Henson, if I may. To Councilman Pridemore and Council Lady Moore, let me say that we're happy to be here at your request to discuss the process and strategies we use in preparing the Metro Schools' annual operating and capital budgets. I'll make just a brief remark and then turn it over to Chris, who's our CFO, for the remainder of the presentation. First, I do want to say, start by saying how appreciative we are for the support this mayoral administration and this Metro Council have shown for public education in Davidson County. I've been a superintendent for almost 27 years now, and this school district in 2 states in 4 different school systems, and this school system is supported by the city better than any other district where I've worked. And I really want to say I appreciate that. That's not to say that we don't have areas that need additional investment. We do. We have many challenges, but our students have benefited greatly from having a mayor and a Metro Council that have put education as the top priority in the budget. Chris will go into greater detail about the budget process, but my approach to the budget is pretty simple. We determine what's needed to support best education for every student. We look at every department, at every office, and at every program to make sure our budget is aligned to benefit our students above all else. And then we work to advocate for the resources that we need. Our job is to present the budget that's needed. Our school board acts on and approves that request as it sees appropriate. And then we cooperatively work with the mayor and his top aides to finalize a budget that he can make work in context with the rest of the city's needs. This has consistently been our approach, and we feel like it's worked very well. I know that it has for the 6.5 years that I've been here. I'll now let Chris go into greater detail about this process.
Thank you, Dr. Register, and I'll try to be brief as well to leave as much time for questions as possible. The school district begins its budget planning preparation at the end of the calendar year. So in December, the school district starts actually reviewing the goals and objectives that are set out in the school district strategic plan, Education 2018. And looking at those goals and objectives, looking at data, particularly data that relates to student achievement and student growth, where are some areas where we need to make improvements, and what kind of strategies can we put in place to make those improvements that are needed. Budget worksheets go out to all of the departments in early January. They spend a good month or so reviewing those requests with their individual executive leadership team member. and then Dr. Register and I meet with each of the 4 other executive leadership team members throughout the month of February and into the first part of March, putting together the first draft proposal of the budget that will be made to the board's Budget and Finance Committee. Ms. Shepard is this year's Budget and Finance Committee chair, and so she has established the calendar that we will be using. The first date for the first Budget and Finance Committee is March the 10th, which is a week from tomorrow at 3:30, where we will be presenting the first draft budget proposal at that point to the board, and the board will spend the next month or so in committee meetings, having discussions, asking questions, receiving clarification, et cetera, regarding the budget proposal that will be made. Then, of course, as you know, the board must approve a budget, and then that budget is submitted to the mayor, and we have a budget hearing with the mayor usually in mid-April, and I think we've actually set that as for mid-April tentatively. And so that's, in a nutshell, the timeline calendar process that we use. Again, it all boils down to looking at where the needs exist, particularly in relation to areas that need more improvement with student achievement and student growth, looking to put as much money out to the schools, the resources out to the schools as possible. You may have seen, and I'll just touch briefly on this, you may have seen where we have changed our budget approach for schools, where we are giving our principals much more flexibility as it relates to dollars and how those dollars can be budgeted and spent, as long as the principals can show that they are tying those budgetary decisions to their own individual school improvement plans. We feel like that schools are different, and we want to give principals that flexibility so that they can design their instructional program as they see fit based upon their own individual needs. And so I'll stop it right there and open it up for questions, Chair, if that's the appropriate way we want to proceed.
That's fine. We'll open it up to the floor now. Councilman Stein?
My question is about your capital process. Are we going to cover that separately, or can I go ahead and ask my question?
We're going to try to keep this at 30 minutes of the operational budget and then 30 minutes of the capital budget.
Yes.
Yes. Councilman Glover.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Henson, I think, was it this year you had 17, roughly, or maybe last year, 17 site-based, what I'm going to call site-based schools where the principal was basically managing the budget. What are you projecting to look at in this coming year, and at what point do you foresee that perhaps the Chief Executive Office, the principal at each one of these schools, will be able to actually manage their own budgets going forward?
Thank you for the question. We made a presentation to the school board last Tuesday in a work session. And just to give a little history, this has been a phased-in approach. Last year, we began with 17 schools that what we were calling school-based budgeting, providing that flexibility to those principals. This would be all of our principals in our innovation zone schools, plus all of our network lead principals. For this year, that expanded to 55 schools, all of our middle schools and all of our high schools, plus the elementary principals that were either innovation zone principals or network lead principals. And for next year, it will go to all of our schools. We are expanding this process, so it's a 3-year phase-in process, expanding it to all of our schools, giving them much, much more flexibility, attempting to provide more equitable distribution of funds to schools based upon individual student needs. And so basically changing the process where in the past the district, based upon a staffing allocation, has told schools, these are the number of positions that you receive, and these are the types of positions based upon your student enrollment. Changing that to, here's a pool of money based upon a transparent calculation to provide more equity across the district. Here's a pool of money based upon your school improvement plan. Work with your school improvement plan facilitator, and you determine what your budget should be. Knowing that there are class size requirements that are set out in state law, so we are going to have, of course, a certain number of teachers by school, but there's a lot more flexibility being given to our principals. And back to your question, the answer is next year it will be all schools.
It's not just 55, all?
Correct.
Okay.
55 are in that process the current year that we're in.
All right, and given that your staff in the finance department is relatively small, will you see any transition from Bransford out into the schools to help, I guess, manage this or oversee it, or will it all take place at Bransford?
It's a combination. One thing that we are using is, as I mentioned, the federal school improvement plan facilitators, SIP facilitators. These individuals, very sharp. They work with all of the schools, all the principals, in first developing what their needs are as far as their school improvement plan goes that's required, then tying those needs into their budgetary request on how they want to spend money. And so we have these individuals out in the schools working with schools and principals every day. There will also, of course, be a checks and balances on the back end in my area that we have included in the budget tool that principals are using.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilman Claiborne?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here, Dr. Register, Mr. Henson, Ms. Shepherd, and others at the corner table. I have a question here, and I'm not sure which 30 minutes it's supposed to go in, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it. It has to do, in the last year's budget, we approved dollars for computers and technology that would be in preparation for Common Core testing. Well, apparently Common Core is up in the air now as to whether we go forward with that or not. So will the coming budget include those dollars that we expected to come forward in addition to last year to continue that process, or will that be tabled until there's a greater surety as to whether Common Core is actually going to be a budgetary matter or not?
That is a capital question. I think the appropriation you made was a one-time appropriation of funds to buy technology, and that technology has been purchased. A part of our operations going forward, and a big part of it, and something that's very important, is a competency-based training program for classroom teachers. And we're at about 98% proficient with our classroom teachers in terms of receiving the competency-based training, and that's in place. That training would enable teachers to differentiate instruction to implement Common Core. As you know, the state's going through taking another look at Common Core. Tennessee standards, the bottom line is they're going to be very similar to Common Core, and the state is adopting this year a new test, a new standards-based test. So we feel like the investment we made is still very much on target, and in any work going forward will be incorporated into our operating budget and capital budget too, if there's a need for, as there is a need for additional computers, but not a special allotment that we can see at this time.
Councilman Garrett?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Register, I know it's kind of hard to predict what's going to happen at the state level, but my question is going to be, and what a lot of council members get, is pay. and it's part of your operations. One of the good things that you did, or through the mayor and yourself and others, came up with the $40,000 figure to a starting salary. Is that something that needs to be addressed? Where are we now? And I mean, like, I think we were third at 40. Do we need to come up with that? How much will that cost? And are you anticipating any kind of pay raise at the state level? Because whatever it is at the state level, we always have more teachers than they require, and we have to match, do more money, have to have more money because we have more teachers than is required. Where are we on our starting pay?
So I'm going to get Chris to address the specifics of what we expect to get if the governor's state of the state is accurate. And but what I'll just make a general comment to start with. We need to be competitive with teacher salaries. Our teachers, we need to continue to stay ahead of that. We want the best teachers for our children in Davidson County. And we also know that this is not an easy place to work, so we've got to be very competitive in recruiting and keeping the very best teachers that we can. In the state, the governor talked about a 4% funding increase for teacher salaries, but with more flexibility. There aren't any requirements that we have to do an across the board or that we have to follow a formula as it did exist. So part of our work in human capital that we'll be presenting to the school board is to look at the best leverage of those state funds that we can make, and also the local commitment. But as you know, a 4% in state funding for MNPS does not equate to a 4% raise. Local funding carries the bigger burden of any salary increases that we pass along. I'll let Chris speak a little more to the specifics.
Let me ask you, do you anticipate going up on the starting salaries to keep us in the top 2 or 3 or wherever?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we will be presenting a proposed salary to the school board on March the 10th as part of our budget proposal. And as Dr. Register said, it is a misnomer when you hear the state's giving a 4% raise and the assumption is the state is funding that 4% raise, which they are not. In the governor's budget proposal, there was an amount included that is about $6.8 million for Davidson County, and it's considered a pool for teacher compensation. An across-the-board 2% raise for all of our teachers costs around $7.5 million. And so you can see the difference there between a 4% and something else. And so what we are looking to do is, I think we're planning to present some sort of combination of some kind of raise, as you say, to keep our starting salaries competitive, and also to reward all of our teachers, but also looking at something that the Chamber of Commerce Report Card Committee recommended, which is to provide some kind of stipend, et cetera, for teachers that have additional leadership roles. And so we are looking at how best to possibly accomplish that and propose that in addition to any kind of across-the-board type raise. But again, the truth of the matter is the state, if the governor's budget proposal passes, the state will be providing a pool of money for teacher compensation in the aggregate of around $6.8 million. And so we will be looking at that amount plus whatever else it might take to do what we might want to propose to the school board and continue those discussions through the month of March, as well as what we would like to do for our support employees.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Only other thing I was going to say, being here a number of years, I was going to say the fact that we raised the starting salary out here, whether I'm in Kroger's or Publix or walking the street or wherever it is, I have to tell you that the number one comment from the public from me was the fact that we raised the opening salary to $40,000, and it caught everybody's attention, and I want that attention to stay, because evidently that was the key. I mean, whether people had kids in school or not, or whatever the circumstances were, but it seemed to be something that resonated with the majority of the people in the county, as they could really see what a starting salary would mean to attract good young teachers.
And it certainly helped with our applicant pool. We rose from 36th in starting salaries in the state to 3rd that year. I think our position may have modified just a little bit, but not very much since then.
Don't let it modify. If this council can help you, please let us modify it in the right direction. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilman Garrett. Councilman Anthony Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Just had a couple questions. Really been enjoying our work on the East Advisory Task Force. Wanted to kind of hit on that for a second. Kind of had a couple things I was going to mention, which is kind of a preview to the school board of some of the things that we want to implement. This does have cost implications. We've been really hitting on the bottom 5 and 25% of the state schools. Obviously, we had several of those in East Nashville. We've got a lot in North Nashville. I think those are the biggest 2 areas that we have them. Some of the larger scale recommendations are obviously going to come with cost. Things like, well, first of all, having the right leader at all those schools, potentially having an assistant principal if needed at those schools, teaching assistants in classrooms, enhanced option where we can. I know we have it in some of these schools, but potentially adding enhanced option at the bottom 5 and 25%. These things cost money. Are we going to be able to implement some significant changes at these schools in both East and North Nashville, I guess, is my first question.
Sure. I'll kick it off and then hand it over to Dr. Register. As part of this transition to what we're calling student-based budgeting, there's another term, weighted student funding, that's equivalent to student-based budgeting, where again, it gets back to trying to provide more equitable funding across the district. Because we know that there are some schools that have equal needs where one school is funded at quite a bit more than another, particularly as it relates to our enhanced option schools, because they go to school an additional 45 minutes a day, plus they have a smaller class size, which is going to be expensive. And so what we're trying to do is to put more dollars into the budget for those equity gains for those schools that have a similar need but need more funding. And at the same time, holding all of our schools harmless. We don't want to decrease funding to any of our schools. We want this to be a positive thing. And so we feel like this transition to student-based budgeting will help in that regard to provide what we're calling more equity gains to the schools that need it.
Yeah, I'll say another word or two about that. I think in the first place, I'd like to say that this move toward a weighted student funding formula is a longer range strategy. We probably won't be able to afford in 1 year to do everything that we would like to do. And that's weighting, and a weighted funding formula, I'll explain very briefly, is simply adding a percentage more increase for different challenges that students have. I'll mention 2 that are very important in our district. One of those is for our English learner population, and that would mean that for a student who's an English learner, that there would be a percentage more of funding given for each student served in a school. The other 2 that are very closely related are poverty, the degree of poverty in a school, and an affiliation with low performance. And so we use those 2 in conjunction, but providing a higher percentage of funding to schools for children who fall into that category. We've done a lot of research on this. We've used a very good consultant, Chris has. We have a young man on staff who did a presentation at our school board meeting. And what I would like, and of course I'm a short-termer, but what I'd like to say is the long-term comprehensive solution to the problems that we're facing in a lot of our schools is to weight this student funding formula with transparency so that we know that the resources are allotted to schools based on the needs of the students in those schools.
And I won't speak for everybody, but I think, there's definitely an appetite for us to see that as a very, specific part of the budget this year, whether it's the weighted or just other creative ways. We really want to, we know we have to act now. The urgency is there on our end to help these bottom 5 and 25% schools. So, I guess I just want specific addressing of this when the budget's coming up. One more question. So also, just more of a general question, with the state funding, is there any, I just want to make sure we're not leaving anything on the table, BEP, is there any money left we can push the state to give us?
Can you say that one more time? I missed the last part of your question.
Just with BEP funding, can we push the state to continue to grow the BEP funding for us?
The answer is yes. We can push, and we have continued to push. I sit on the state BEP review committee. I've sat on that committee now for about 15 years. Made recommendations to the governor and the legislature every year in a November 1 report. That is something that we continually hope that we will see more improvement in the funding formula, because basically all of the money that comes to school districts from the state comes through that BEP funding formula. And so there are a number of inadequacies with the formula as it currently stands that were supposed to be rectified in 2007 with BEP 2.0 that have never been fully funded or implemented. And so the short answer is yes, that pressure needs to continue to be there.
Cool. I just want to make sure we're not leaving anything on the table. Of course, I think bias that the urban districts should get more. That's the formula itself. But if we can just make the pie bigger, obviously, in general, we'll continue to get more funding.
Really, really important last comment there. The two issues in terms of state funding that I think are very important are the issue of equity and the issue of adequacy. And as you know, the small systems have won a couple of lawsuits over the last 2 decades in this state, and those lawsuits have been won on the basis of equity. The systems that don't have the tax base and the local support that we have been on that side of the issue. The new issue is an issue, or the one that's important now is an issue of adequacy. Are there any school systems in this state that have adequate pupil funding to do the things that are needed to do? And I think that's the side of this issue that urban school systems like Nashville have to raise questions about.
Is that answer? Thank you. Councilman Davis? Councilman Bedney?
Thank you. So is Williamson County considered an urban district or a rural district? Rural, right? So they get a bigger portion of BEP. That's interesting. So question about charter schools and the financing. I was looking at the audit, and apparently...
Councilman Bedney, as I said earlier, we're going to try to keep the audit part, if it's not related to the budget process, to next Thursday, if we could.
Okay.
When it's going to be totally dedicated to the audit.
All right, then a question for you, unrelated. Is there a way that we can do what we did last year and have the charter schools to come here and address the council as well?
Well, I guess, who was it? It'd be more to the school board. You would ask them.
Okay.
At us? You're wanting us to invite the...
Yeah, just like we did last year. I mean, we spend a significant amount of the budget on through the schools to finance the charter schools. So I think last year was very educational.
Hmm? Yeah, we can look at that. Chair Councilor Moore, you can discuss that with her.
All right, thank you, sir.
Councilor Dow.
Thank you. I hope I'm on the right topic. But I did want to ask, you kind of addressed it. In looking at our audit recently, I noticed that Cane Ridge High School, I know you said that got a little bit less money, so I'm glad you addressed the weighted average, because I do want to hear more about that during budget time. But I wanted to ask about the pre-K program and funding for that. I know that there's a planned site out at the Southeast Regional Library about any impact on that as far as budgetary, and also the Southeast area, of course, you know, is growing by leaps and bounds. There have been interest in a middle college and education expansion out there with Nashville State Community College, and I wonder, are those some considerations in this upcoming budget proposal that you have, and where do you see that standing this time?
The Nashville State budget, of course, and that issue is one that we support very strongly, but that's apart from our budget. I appreciate the question about early childhood, and the first thing I want to say is that you stepped up last year. We made a request for capital and operating budget to increase our early childhood, our pre-K initiative in Davidson County, and we've done that. We've started 3 model centers and are very proud of that. We also persuaded the state commissioner and the governor's office to support applying for U.S. Department of Education early childhood grant. The governor had decided not to do that for the state of Tennessee, but he did it. He did request that USDOE grant for Shelby County schools and for Davidson County schools, and we got it. And over a several-year period of time, that's a $30 million grant, $30 million that we'll receive. That will fund our growth, and because of your commitment last year to an increased budget, that meets our local match. So we are looking forward to expanding pre-K initiative, and that should not, other than just inflationary costs for what we're already putting into pre-K, should not demand an increase of Metro Council.
Thank you, Council Lady Dowell. Council Lady Moore.
Just a quick question to Mr. Henson. Just wanted to ask you about you had mentioned school-based budgeting, student-based budgeting. Is that about the same?
The difference between school-based budgeting and student-based budgeting is we have been utilizing school-based budgeting for the last couple of years, which is a process where we basically took the same staffing allocations that we had in prior years and monetized those resources, as far as instead of numbers of positions and certain types of positions, we have monetized those into a dollar amount to give school principals a pool amount of money for them to determine the best approach for their schools based upon their school improvement plan. Student-based budgeting is the weighted student funding, where we have different weights based upon student needs. And so it's a more equitable distribution of funding, while also holding current schools harmless from any reduction they might receive from this transition. And so it's a transition from school-based, which is giving principals that flexibility, to student-based, which is continuing that flexibility, but changing somewhat the distribution of funding, tying it more toward individual student needs as opposed to a district staffing formula.
So a student need would be based on, just like some of these schools have initiatives like before school tutoring, Saturday tutoring, would that be based on student-based budgeting, where you pay a teacher to come in before school to do tutoring, or you have Saturday tutoring, you'll pay a teacher to do that? Is that based on that?
If that's what the school chooses,
Okay.
If that's how the school chooses to use their funding allocation, yes, they can definitely do that.
Thank you.
Councilman Glover.
Ms. Shepherd, I realize you haven't seen the budget yet, so it's going to be almost impossible to answer this question. But when the budget is rolled out on the 10th, I believe you said, Mr. Henson, when the budget is rolled out on the 10th, what's going to be the process the board is going to, as chair of the Budget and Finance, what's going to be your process to make sure that we keep the programs that have been successful? Example, and since we're talking about areas, the McGavitt cluster, the academies have been extremely successful in that cluster, along with the middle schools and new programs that are taking place. What will be your process to make sure that we ensure that we protect those things that have been successful? And what is going to be the procedure for perhaps eliminating, from the board's perspective, those things that may not have been as successful or may not be worth the investment that is going into them at this time?
That's a good question. And of course, we will be looking at line by line, and we've already, I have already started looking at some of those programs as well, especially as it relates to the schools in my cluster. And also, as we flesh that out, I would encourage my colleagues, and have already done so, to reach out to their Metro Council representatives and have one-on-one meetings with them and ask them, what they think is important, what the line items that they would like to see increase or decrease, or what programs that they know of personally that are not successful or are very, maybe don't have the rate of return that we would like to see on those investments. So that's what I will be encouraging the board to do, and take a very keen line-by-line item look at everything that's on the budget.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Glover. Moving on to the capital portion of the presentation, Councilman Stein, do you still have a question concerning the capital?
Wait till after the talk.
Okay. Mr. Henson?
Yes, regarding the board's capital improvement budget process, that process, just from a timeline perspective, typically begins around October, sometime in the fall. The board, through its committee, has numerous discussions. Mr. Ken Murdoch, who is here, is our Director of Facility Planning and Construction. What we do is we basically look at what was requested in the prior year capital budget, what was funded, and what was not funded. Beginning at that point, we have, through a survey mechanism, a very detailed survey mechanism, we have what's called a condition score for each of our schools, for each of our buildings. And it's based upon between 30 and 40 different components that go into that calculation. And the buildings or the schools that have the lowest condition score obviously rise to the top of the priority list. And we also look at building utilization, which means that if a school is overcrowded, then we are looking at either a classroom addition or potentially needing to build a new school to handle the student growth that's occurring. So we look at a combination of building condition scores as well as building utilization in determining what the priorities are for the requests that would be made in relation to our school facilities. Also, as part of our capital improvement budget process, we look at other things such as the need for additional school buses. Also looking at things such as deferred maintenance that not necessarily tied to one specific building, but is a need that requires additional funding, such as HVAC or plumbing or different things of that nature, that it's more of a district-wide kind of capital need. We also look at technology and what is needed as far as new technology, as well as a refresh of the existing technology that exists all across the district, all across our schools. And so all of those things looked at together, a draft of a capital improvement budget is presented to the board's capital needs committee. It's according to what is required by Metro Planning. It's a 6-year capital improvement budget, and so we try to look at things within that first year that would be deemed highest priority, and then the next priority list would be in year 2 on down the line, and we actually break this down to a 10-year master facility plan, where we have the first 6 years that are required by the Metro Planning Commission, and then we have a column years 7 through 10, or beyond year 6. And so that's something that we try to keep current. We try to use objective data to determine what the priorities are as it relates to schools with the lowest condition scores and schools that have the highest utilization rate.
Thank you, Mr. Henson. Councilman Stein.
Thank you. So, excuse me. So it is a 8-year plan that is revised annually?
It's actually a 10-year plan that's revised annually. The requirement to submit by the end of January to the Metro Planning Commission is a 6-year capital improvement budget.
Okay, and so in this process has been going on for some time. So for example, starting in 2007, there would have been a 10-year plan that was...
That's correct.
It would just be interesting, I think, from our perspective, to perhaps, if that's still available, to see in the course of, for those of us that have been on council, some only for 4, but some of us for 8, what progress we have made on what was on the list at that particular time, because I know there has been, this is a setup question, because I know there's been tremendous progress, even though there's still lots more to do. But I think it would be very helpful to us, because predominant amount of questions have to do with what gets fixed when and how that takes place, and obviously that's the board's purview to do that and not ours, but the better we can understand that and the better we can articulate that process might be helpful. And I'm not trying to make work because you've got a lot going on, but if it's possible to take a look at that, that would be very interesting, I think, to us.
Sure. What we could do, we could provide what the board approved for each year and then what was actually funded for each year. Be glad to.
Thank you, Councilman Stein. Councilman Wainwright.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate it. I want to step back for just a second, if I might, just to get a point of clarification on our previous 30-minute conversation, and then I'll go to my current question. When you spoke to establishing the criteria for how you're going to fund these different programs and allocate per school, you spoke of poverty, you spoke of low performers, and ESL. So my question goes to the low performers. Does that include the special ed programming for say, the gifted programs and the other, like poor language learners?
I'll get into a little more detail on the weights. There is what we call a base amount for each student, and then added onto that would be different weights depending upon student need. And as Dr. Register mentioned, we do have a weight for English language learners status. We have a weight also for prior academic performance. And so, for instance, if a student performed poorly, which would mean below proficient in 4th grade, incoming 5th grader, then that middle school is going to receive additional weight for that student. Same 8th grade coming into 9th grade for that high school that would be receiving that student. Since we don't have necessarily a kindergarten readiness type of assessment, what we use for the elementary, the incoming kindergarten, would be poverty as a proxy. We also have weights for exceptional education status, and they vary. There's quite a wide range depending upon level of disability. Within the State Department of Education, there are, I think, 10 different options based upon level of disability, based upon number of hours served, and so we have different weights as it relates to that level of disability for each student based upon their own IEP. And all of that is included in the calculation within the student-based budgeting. What we've tried to do in this first year is to keep it somewhat simple, and we're following along the footsteps of some other districts across the country who have done this. We don't want to repeat the same errors or mistakes maybe that others have made. We also don't want to recreate the wheel. And so we're looking at other places like Denver and like Baltimore and New York and some of these other big urban districts that have already embarked on this process. And the thing that we kept being told was, at least first year, keep it as simple as you can. And so we may very well be adding additional weights into future years. We also may be looking at what's included in the pool that's available to schools and expanding that to, again, push more resources out to the school level once principals become more comfortable with this process. You mentioned specifically gifted and talented, and we have determined this year that we're not going to make that a part of the weights, but what we're going to do is to continue to fund it just as we have in prior years. It will be funded from a district-wide budget. The services will be centrally provided through the Encore program just as they have in prior years.
So you don't foresee any changes to your gifted program or to your special education per se programming as it stands? That's going to be pretty consistent with what you've done in the past years?
That's my understanding at this point.
Okay.
Yes.
So now we'll go to my second question, if that's okay. How do you determine future capacity of a school such that you don't build to overcrowding in the short term of that new school?
We use data from our student assignment office, which is based upon 5-year projections, and they have very detailed calculations of what those 5-year projections look like. They work very closely with the Metro Planning Department. They use live birth data. And so what we try to do is to plan, as you say, to plan based upon 5-year projections. And typically what we do is that first year that we make the request, we're requesting land to build a new school. And then following that, once that request is made, we'll make a request for the actual funding to build the school, or alternatively to add a classroom wing at an individual school. So we attempt to try to keep up with growth. We know that there is growth occurring in some parts of the county, major significant growth in some parts of the county, whereas it's not occurring in other parts of the county. So we also try to balance, is there the potential to, for instance, to rezone students from one particular area to another area to help alleviate overcrowding. So that's one thing that we also look at. Rezoning is never easy. It's never an easy thing to do, but to be good stewards is something that has to be considered as opposed to only looking at adding classrooms or building new schools. And so we've, I think, done a fairly good job recently, because once we are finished with these new projects that are underway, we should be in much better shape than we've been in for a number of years as far as overcrowded schools, where we're going to be opening 2 new elementary schools this year, and we will be completing a number of classroom addition projects this coming year that all will be ready in August.
Great, and I have one last question. How do you determine which schools, or what criteria do you use to determine which schools you're just going to close, whether the school is inappropriate for renovation? And no, I'm not talking about the Hillwood Bellevue thing. I'm talking about all over. How do you make that decision on what you do with the building?
There's a difference between closing and consolidating a school and then replacing a school. And so I'll touch on the replacement part, and if Dr. Register wants to touch on the closing consolidation part. But what we do is we want to be obviously good stewards of the public dollars. And so, for instance, with Tusculum Elementary and with Goodlettsville Middle School, we looked at the facility in detail to see, is this a facility that would make sense to renovate based upon the number of additions it's had over the years, based upon the condition of the building? Is it such that it can be renovated to a space that we feel would be educationally appropriate for students in this day and age? Sometimes the answer is yes. We've renovated a lot of buildings, but sometimes, again, with the examples of Tusculum and Goodlettsville Middle School, the answer is no. We feel like it would be a much better use of taxpayer dollars to demolish the building, replace it with a new building. And so there are a number of complexities involved in making that determination. And again, Mr. Murdoch back in the back would be able to provide, if you want more detail relating to that. But we look at that every time we're considering whether or not to renovate or replace.
Thank you.
He answer your question?
Thank you, Chair. Yes.
Closing, about closing schools, how do we make that decision? That's a tough decision to make. And we've have an example. Last year, we closed 2 elementary schools and repurposed them, and we're very proud of that. Ross and Bordeaux are schools that were small and low-performing elementary schools, and so we reassigned students there in those schools and opened model pre-K centers in those schools. Making decisions to close schools is very much a community process, and we haven't done much of that. In most of Davidson County, underutilized facilities are not our problem. In some areas, we have excess capacity in schools, but I think we have to move with caution when we look at doing that and make sure we don't disrupt community schools or programs that have a tradition. Another example of closing or doing away with a building is the old Jerry Baxter School. And that was a school that we had pretty much determined was a school that we didn't need, and the building condition was very poor. I think building condition's very important here, different set of issues, and that property would have been available commercially or for some other purpose if Metro government had a purpose for it that we didn't have. The building we considered not worth renovating and wouldn't serve us well. It's used as a charter school now. We had a request from a charter school to use that facility, and we've approved that.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 10 minutes left, so take that in consideration. We have quite a few people in the queue. Councilman Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the weather as the way it is on the capital projects that are going on at the present time, and you happen to mention one that's where I'm living, are we behind or are we on time? Or is that a question for somebody back here?
No, I keep a pretty close tab on that question. I ask Mr. Murdoch that probably every week. As far as the two new elementary schools, we believe that they are on time, that they're going to be complete when school begins in 1st of August. Of course, the school that you're probably most interested in is not scheduled to open in August. And if you've driven by there, which I'm sure you have, you would know that it would not. That particular building, because of some issues that have arisen through the demolition process. So there's been a few underground issues, et cetera. I'm not exactly sure of the estimated timeline as far as when that one will open. I know originally there was a particular timeline that was an estimated timeline. So once we actually begin the construction with the contractor and have a better feel for it, we'll be glad to, obviously we'll be communicating that out as far as when we believe that school will be ready. But at this point, the ones that are key as far as rezoning, as far as other kinds of things for next year, we believe that they will be completed on time.
Whether I'm here or not, please keep the district council member involved, and whether it's that particular school or Tusculum or any of the rest of them, it would be a good thing to let, I know the members, to let their council members know if you happen to get behind, so that those kind of questions council members get all the time. Second question, are there any buildings that are old schools that are sitting out there deteriorating? We had some schools that were like that for a while. Are there, like Morney and Wade and schools like that for years? Are there any schools that are out there that need to be sold, need to be put back over? I mean, that are for whatever particular reason, they're just not being done?
Currently, there are no vacant buildings.
That's the first. Thank you. That's all I need to hear.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Garrett. Councilman Bedney.
Thank you, Chair. I was just reading the audit the other day, and my cluster, Overton, has 77 portables. The second cluster with more portables, and the third are Overton and Antioch. So we are plugged. We have so many portables, it's not even funny, and it's not acceptable. It's not also acceptable to keep adding classrooms to schools. So we recently, I have reached out to charter schools to see if they will come into my area. We recently got a great project that Council Lady Dowell has been pushing a 300-acre development, and we were able to get the developer to set aside land for the school. So the question, the $1 million question or $10 million question is, how do we expedite when we are working with the developer and we get them to set aside land to make sure that school gets built as soon as possible? Because what I notice in the district every time you guys finish school, it's already overcrowded with portables in the lawn. So I know it's a question for us as well because we need to do the funding, but how do we streamline and expedite the process?
Well, we're happy when the developer does donate land as they are required to do based upon certain size of a development, as long as the land is usable for a building. We have had some instances in the past where the property that was being donated was not necessarily usable for a school, and so that's the first step. Is in a situation like that, we need to be sure that the land is usable for a school, and it very well may be for this one. But as far as expediting the process, we're more than happy to expedite the process through the capital improvement budget process, submitting that. Of course, that's a recommendation that's made to the council from the mayor and then ultimately approved by the Metro Council. But we want to see overcrowding alleviated as much or more than you do, and so we'll be firm advocates in trying to expedite or fast track any project that's needed.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilman Bedney. Council Lady Blaylock.
Thank you. So you've mentioned Tusculum a few times. That's my question. So give me an update on the Tusculum and Lowe's, and then also when would the rezoning, I'm sure, would have to happen for that area? When do you expect that to be complete?
I'll give you my best answer because that project has been somewhat of a difficult one. As you know, there was funding included in the board's capital improvement budget request for a new Overton cluster elementary school. And so the school board or the district, in conjunction with the Public Properties Office, has been working to purchase the old Lowe's building that will be renovated and converted to an elementary school. There have been issues with the seller. We do have an option on the property, but there have been issues with the seller, and also there have been issues that have been identified with the facility itself. And so we're in the process of working through those. Our goal is for the current Tusculum students and staff to relocate to that building once it's renovated as an elementary school, so that Tusculum can be demolished and a new Tusculum Elementary built. Until we're able to determine what time frame the Tusculum students and staff can be relocated, whether that's something that can occur at the first of the school year, or is that something that might occur over fall break. We don't really want it to get any further than that, because then we might get into the schedule of the new Tusculum Elementary being built. And so we're pushing that as hard and fast as we can, working with the Public Properties Office. And so as far as the rezoning goes, what we try to do is to have the rezoning approved close to a year in advance. And so it would be a year before the school opened would be when we would like to have all of the rezoning actually completed and approved.
Okay, and then one more quick question. Does all of the charter schools get the free breakfast and lunches?
I'm looking back at Mr. Carr, and he's shaking his head no, and I think it probably depends upon whether or not they participate in our meal program. Some of them do, and if they do, nod your head if I'm correct. If they do, then they participate or not.
The charter schools have a choice to participate in our program or do one of their own, or participate in the regular free and reduced lunch program. And some charters have made each of those choices. We have more charters that are interested in using our school nutrition operation next year, because basically we come in and do it all for them. And it completely eliminates hassle for them, and we feed all of the kids. So it's up to the charter school.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. One last question, Council Lady Allen.
Thank y'all for being here. Just wondered if, while we're getting the reports on the 10-year plan, if we could also get the condition report that went along with that. Is that possible? Great, thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Council Lady Moore.
I just want to say thank you. We're going to wrap this up and say thank you to Dr. Register and Chris Henson and Anna Shepard for, being here this afternoon and allowing us to answer questions. And to our distinguished school board members, it's 8 of you all here, so we could have a meeting. Only one missing, so I see Dr. Brandon back there in the back. So, but thank you all so much for being here today, and this was all good. Okay.
Thank you very much. Meeting's adjourned.